And that's a good indication of the way that our perceptions deceive us. And you know, one of the things you might notice is, what kind of emotional reaction do you have when your computer ceases to be a laptop while you're working on something important? What's your response? Frustration and anger, mostly, yeah, and there'd be some anxiety in that too, and probably some contempt, you know, because you might say, well, this stupid bloody thing, or something like that, which is an expression of contempt, which is associated with disgust. And then there's the anxiety, which is, oh my God, what am I going to do with this now? And then there's the anger, and that as a consequence of something interfering with your goal-directed pursuit. And so one of the things that's really worthwhile to note is to note that panoply of emotions. Now, there might also be a little excited, possibly, because you could say, oh, well, I wanted to get rid of this piece of junk anyways, and get a new computer, right? Because, so when it collapses into its sub-elements, this mess of sub-elements, there's all sorts of possibilities that immediately arise that your nervous system is attuned to, and the way your nervous system responds to that is it gets frustrated and angry, it gets afraid, it gets disgusted, and it gets curious about what's going to happen next. And all of that happens at the same time. And I would say that that response, which is an embodied response and an instinctive response, although there's cognitive elaborations on it, that's the response you have when you actually see the actual world, or as close as you're going to get to it. Because I don't think that you see the world at all until the things you're doing don't work. And as soon as they don't work, bang, you see the world. Now, see is a weird way to think about that. But then we could say, well, that's the closest you ever get to having contact with the thing in itself. And it's very, very stressful to have contact with the thing in itself, because God only knows what it's going to do. So, your conceptual systems protect you from contact with reality. In the same manner, one of the things Jung said, which I think is extraordinarily funny, he said, the purpose of religious systems is to stop people from having religious experiences. It's an extraordinarily remarkable and intelligent claim. Because, you know, do you really want to have a religious experience? That'll tear you into bits. Yeah.
It's interesting how we continuously recover from this encounter with things that are not the real world when it stops working. That must take a lot of effort.
Well, think about how we do it. You know, like say something collapses on you, like your car breaks down. I mean, do you actually solve that problem? Well, generally you don't, right? What you do is you parse off the problem to someone else whose knowledge about the multi-level reality of the automobile is much more detailed and differentiated than yours. And so partly the way we deal with the complexity of the world is that we set ourselves up as a distributed supercomputer, and we can call on elements of that supercomputing process at any given time to increase our level of resolution of the world and to solve the problem. And so partly we solve it as individuals, but a huge chunk of it is that we solve it as a consequence of continual communication. And that's also become increasingly obvious since the rise of the internet, because now I don't care what problem you have, there's a high probability that someone somewhere, merely as a consequence of the innate altruism of human beings, has put together an extraordinarily detailed video on exactly how to solve this little micro problem that's beset you, which is really a fascinating and unexamined phenomena, because I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that. I wanted to change the stereo. I have an old car, and I wanted to change the stereo, so the search was how to replace a stereo in a 2005 Hyundai Sonata. You know, and some guy down in the US, for some reason, videotaped himself doing it, and there it was. And it's really quite cool that that happens, because, you know, psychologists and evolutionary psychologists and biologists always argue about whether there is such a thing as actual altruism. And, you know, it's hard not to see someone taking the time to post, you know, to post an observation of them undertaking a complex task for no financial reward whatsoever. It's hard not to see that as a form of, you know, spontaneous altruism. It's very, very cool. Yep.